Welcome back to Gotham Trends. Today, we're diving into, it's a situation that's unfolding in Chicago.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's got everyone talking.
Hmm.
ICE is planning a big operation to apprehend people with removal orders, particularly folks with criminal records.
Yeah, and what makes this a really interesting case is that Chicago considers itself a sanctuary city.
Right.
So you have this like head-to-head, federal immigration enforcement going up against the city and their, commitment to protecting their immigrant communities.
Yeah, we've got this real tension brewing here. Federal law versus local policies. How's this actually going to play out, like, on the ground? What are the implications for everyone involved?
Well, to really understand the potential impact, we got to start by unpacking what it even means for Chicago to be a sanctuary city.
Okay, so let's break that down. What does sanctuary city even mean? What policies are we talking about here?
Basically, it means Chicago has these policies in place that limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement.
Okay.
One of the key things is they don't honor these things called ICE detainers.
ICE detainers.
Yeah, basically, there are these requests from ICE asking local law enforcement to hold people even after they're supposed to be released so ICE can, take them into custody.
So even if ICE finds someone they want to pick up,
Yeah.
Chicago's not obligated to hold them.
That's exactly right. And on top of that, Chicago's got policies that make it hard to share information about undocumented immigrants with ICE.
Okay.
Makes it tougher for ICE to track people down.
Interesting. So these sanctuary policies, these seem to be throwing some roadblocks up for IC. Why would a city even choose to limit their cooperation with federal immigration enforcement?
The biggest thing is it's about building trust between immigrant communities and the local police.
Okay.
The idea is that if people are too scared to report crimes or talk to the police because they're afraid of getting deported, that makes the city less safe for everyone.
So you're saying sanctuary policies could actually make the city safer as a whole?
That's the theory. The city's hoping that by creating this environment where undocumented immigrants feel safe, using city services, talking to authorities without constantly worrying about being handed over to ICE, that'll encourage more cooperation and make it easier to address things like crime and public health.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I imagine the federal government's got a very different perspective on these sanctuary city policies. What's their take on it?
Well, from the federal government's point of view, particularly with the current administration, sanctuary cities are seen as obstacles to enforcing immigration laws. They argue that these cities are basically harboring undocumented immigrants, even those with criminal records, and that this is encouraging more people to come to the U.S. illegally.
So they see these operations as a way to reassert federal authority over immigration enforcement.
Absolutely. They want to send a very clear message. We're going to enforce immigration laws, whether local authorities like it or not.
And they're definitely making a statement with the sheer scale of this operation. What can you tell us about ICE's plan?
This is a big operation. We're talking about 200 ICE officers being deployed to Chicago for multiple days. Their goal is to arrest individuals with removal orders, particularly those with criminal records.
Hold on, just to clarify, what exactly is a removal order? I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with that term.
Oh, yeah, sure. A removal order is basically a legal document issued by an immigration judge. It orders someone to be deported from the United States.
Okay.
So it's like a final decision that someone's here illegally and has to leave.
So these are people who've already been through the immigration court process and have been ordered to leave the country. It's not just random sweeps targeting anyone who might be undocumented.
That's right. ICE is focusing on individuals who've already had their day in court, so to speak, and have these outstanding removal orders, especially those who also have criminal records.
Got it. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
So 200 officers targeting individuals with removal orders sounds like a major show of force. What kind of tactics are they planning to use?
ICE is going to be using a whole mix of tactics, things like gathering intel, doing surveillance, and even coordinated entries into homes and workplaces.
Coordinated entries into homes and workplaces.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of controversial, especially in a city that's trying to build trust with its immigrant communities.
It definitely raises some concerns about the possibility of collateral arrests.
Collateral arrests.
Yeah, that's when people who aren't actually the targets end up getting caught up in the operation. Like, say ICE goes into a home looking for someone specific with a removal order. Other people who are there, even if they're here legally, could be questioned or even detained.
So this kind of operation could have like a domino effect, impacting not just those ICE is after, but their families and their communities too.
Absolutely. And that's a major point of friction between the federal government and sanctuary cities. Chicago's trying to protect its residents while the feds are prioritizing enforcement, even if it means disrupting lives and potentially separating families.
It sounds like a very complicated situation, a lot of emotions involved, and both sides feel really strongly about their positions.
It definitely is, and the stakes are incredibly high. The outcome of this standoff could have a huge impact on immigration policy and the lives of so many people.
Yeah, this is a story we'll be keeping a close eye on for sure. But before we go deeper into the possible consequences of this operation, let's take a look at the history of sanctuary cities. Where did this idea even come from, and how has it evolved over time? We'll be exploring that right after the break.
So the idea of sanctuary cities is actually pretty deep-rooted, goes all the way back to, religious and social justice movements.
Really? I
Uh-huh.
had no idea. Tell me more about where this idea came from. How did it get tied to immigration?
Well, it all started with churches basically offering refuge to folks who are facing persecution, often for political reasons.
Okay.
They wanted to give them a safe space, a sanctuary to escape from harm. And this idea, it kind of grew over time. It started to encompass more of those broad social justice movements, like the fight for civil rights and protecting refugees fleeing conflict.
So how did the idea of sanctuary, which initially seemed focused on protecting individuals from harm,
Yeah.
how did that get connected specifically to protecting undocumented immigrants?
Yeah, that shift really gained traction back in the 1980s during the Central American refugee crisis.
Okay.
You had a lot of cities and churches all over the U.S. offering sanctuary to refugees escaping violence and civil wars in places like El Salvador and Guatemala.
So it sounds like that was a turning point. The idea of sanctuary broadened to include protecting people seeking asylum or facing deportation.
That's right. And as immigration enforcement got stricter in the following decades, the idea of sanctuary cities as places that didn't really cooperate with federal immigration authorities well, that really started to take hold.
So it's been this gradual evolution, starting with protecting individuals from harm and eventually extending to protecting undocumented immigrants from deportation.
Exactly. And it's still evolving today, especially with the immigration debate getting even more intense.
Which brings us to the current debate. I'm curious to hear more about the arguments against sanctuary city policies. What are some of the main criticisms from people who oppose these policies?
Well, one of the biggest ones you hear is that these policies make cities less safe because they're protecting criminals from being deported.
That's a pretty serious claim.
Yeah.
Where's the evidence for that? Are there any statistics that back that up?
Critics will often point to high-profile cases where undocumented immigrants who committed crimes were let go by local authorities instead of being handed over to ICE.
So they're saying that these individuals should have been deported and that sanctuary policies prevented that.
Exactly. They believe that these policies prioritize the rights of undocumented immigrants over the safety of citizens and legal residents.
It's a pretty loaded argument. What do supporters of sanctuary cities say to that? How do they respond to concerns about public safety?
People who support sanctuary cities say that this whole focus on crime is just a way to distract people, to demonize immigrants and create fear.
So are they saying that this narrative about sanctuary cities being full of dangerous criminals is misleading?
That's what they argue. They'll point to data that shows crime rates in sanctuary cities are often lower than in cities without these policies.
Interesting. So the data doesn't really seem to back up the idea that sanctuary cities are automatically more dangerous. Is there anything else fueling this opposition to sanctuary city policies?
Another big argument against them is that they create a magnet effect that pulls more undocumented immigrants to those cities.
So the idea is that if people know they're less likely to get deported from a certain city, they'll be more likely to move there.
Exactly. Critics say that this puts a strain on resources and encourages more people to come to the country illegally.
I could see how that argument would resonate with folks who want stricter immigration controls.
It fits into this broader narrative about the need for strong borders and enforcing immigration laws.
It feels like this whole issue comes down to a fundamental difference in values and priorities. People who support sanctuary cities emphasize compassion and integration, while those who oppose them prioritize enforcement and national security.
You got it. It's a very divisive issue that reflects a lot of the bigger tensions in our society about immigration diversity and the role of government.
It's fascinating how this situation in Chicago brings all these complex issues to the surface. We've got tension between federal and local authorities, clashing ideologies, and a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds for immigrant communities.
For sure. And it's important to remember that we're talking about policies and legal arguments, but there are actual people whose lives are directly affected by these decisions.
Speaking of the human impact, I'd like to shift gears a bit and talk about the challenges ICE faces when trying to enforce immigration laws in a city like Chicago, a city that's actively resisting those efforts. How do sanctuary policies affect ICE's ability to carry out their mission? What kind of obstacles do they run into on the ground?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how complex this situation is. Sanctuary city policies create a very different environment for IC to operate in.
Right. You said earlier that sanctuary policies create a different operational landscape for IC.
Hmm.
Can you elaborate on that? How do these policies actually affect IC's ability to do their job in a city like Chicago?
One of the biggest hurdles for ICE is just getting the information they need. Chicago's policies limit how much data they can share with ICE, which means IC can't easily use local databases to find people with removal orders.
So instead of getting help from the city, they have to rely on other, maybe less efficient methods to track people down.
Yeah, they often have to use methods that take more time and resources, like surveillance, relying on tips from the community and building their own intelligence networks. It makes their job a whole lot harder.
And I'd imagine that also increases the risk of making mistakes, right?
Yeah.
If they don't have all the information, they're more likely to misidentify someone or detain the wrong person.
You're absolutely right. That's a huge concern. And when mistakes like that happen, it just makes things worse. It erodes trust in law enforcement even more and fuels that fear and anxiety in immigrant communities.
It seems like a no-win situation. ICE needs help from local authorities to be effective, but sanctuary cities are by definition resistant to giving them that level of cooperation.
It's a fundamental conflict at the core of this issue, and there's no easy answer. Both sides are dug in, and finding common ground is proving to be incredibly tough.
And this isn't just some theoretical debate. There are real people, real families caught in the middle of all this. We've talked about the fear and uncertainty this operation is creating for immigrant communities, but I'm wondering if you could say more about the long-term consequences. What happens to a community when they live under this kind of constant threat?
The long-term effects on these communities can be really damaging. This constant fear of being targeted by law enforcement can lead to social isolation. People become afraid to leave their homes or talk to anyone outside their closest circle. It can also hurt the local economy. Businesses suffer. People are afraid to go to work or spend money.
So it's not just about individuals being deported, it's about the wider impact on the community itself.
Exactly. And that's something that often gets overlooked in all the political back and forth. This isn't just some abstract argument about immigration policy. It's about real lives, real families, real communities being torn apart.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The history of sanctuary cities, the arguments for and against them, the challenges ICE faces when enforcing immigration laws in this environment, and the profound impact all of this has on immigrant communities.
It's a complex and emotionally charged issue with no simple solutions.
As we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've spent a lot of time talking about the legal and political side of things, but at its heart, this is a human story. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we try to figure out how to deal with this complex issue as a society.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get lost in all the abstract debates, but we can't forget the human cost of these policies.
I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a really informative conversation. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the planned ICE operation in Chicago. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. We encourage you to keep learning about this issue and to share your thoughts and perspectives with us. We always appreciate hearing from you. Thanks for subscribing to Gotham Trends. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to Gotham Trends. We've been talking about the ICE operation that's planned in Chicago, a city that's really become known for its sanctuary policies. We've gone over the history of sanctuary cities, the arguments for and against those policies, and how this clash between federal and local authorities is playing out.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue with a lot on the line, and it's so important to understand what ICE is up against when they're trying to operate in a place where they're not getting a lot of local cooperation.
Right. You were saying earlier that sanctuary policies create a different kind of playing field for ICO. Can you talk more about that? How do these policies affect ICE's ability to do their job in a city like Chicago?
One of the biggest things is that they don't have access to information. Chicago has these policies that make it hard for them to share data with ICE. So ICE can't just look at local databases to find people who have removal orders.
So they can't rely on the city to help them, and they have to use other ways to find people, which are probably less effective.
Exactly. It takes a lot more time and resources. They have to do things like surveillance, rely on tips from the community, and build their own intelligence networks. It makes their job a whole lot harder.
And I imagine that also increases the chances of them making mistakes, right? I mean, if they don't have all the information they need, they're more likely to get the wrong person or detain someone who shouldn't be detained.
You're absolutely right. It's a big concern. And when those kinds of mistakes happen, it just makes the situation worse. People lose trust in law enforcement, and it creates even more fear and anxiety in immigrant communities.
It seems like a Catch-22 ICE needs the local authorities to cooperate if they want to be effective. But sanctuary cities, by their very nature, are designed to resist that kind of cooperation.
That's the heart of the problem. It's a fundamental conflict, and there's no easy solution. Both sides feel very strongly about their positions, and it's really hard to find any kind of common ground.
And it's not just a theoretical debate. There are actual people, families, who are caught in the middle of all this. We've talked about how this operation is making people in immigrant communities feel afraid and uncertain. But what about the long-term effects? What happens to a community that has to live under this kind of constant threat?
The long-term consequences can be really devastating. This constant fear of law enforcement can make people isolate themselves. They're afraid to go out of their homes or talk to anyone who's not in their immediate circle. It can even hurt the local economy. Businesses suffer because people are afraid to go to work or spend money.
So it's not just about individual people being deported, it's about how the whole community is affected.
Exactly. And that's what often gets lost in all the political arguments. It's easy to forget that this isn't just some abstract debate about immigration policy. It's about real lives, real families, real communities being torn apart.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The history of sanctuary cities, the arguments for and against them, the difficulties ICE faces when trying to enforce immigration laws in a city like Chicago, and the impact all of this has on immigrant communities.
It's a complicated issue with a lot of emotions involved, and there are no simple answers.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We spent a lot of time focusing on the laws and the politics, but at the end of the day, this is a human story. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. And I think it's really important to remember that as we as a society try to find a way forward.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get caught up in all the abstract arguments, but we can't lose sight of the human cost.
I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Your insights have been really valuable. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the ICE operation in Chicago. We hope this has given you some food for thought, and we encourage you to continue learning about this issue and share your own perspectives with us. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for subscribing to Gotham Trends. We'll see you next time.